Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The flickering light of a dozen candles cast long shadows across the study. Catherine stood in the center of the room, her eyes fixed on the worn ancient scrolls spread before her. Her father's study, once a place of warmth and knowledge, now felt like a tomb echoing the sickness that plagued Lord Roderick. The air was thick with the scent of herbs and potions that had done nothing to halt the mysterious illness wasting him away. Catherine ran her hand over one of the scrolls, its parchment brittle under her fingertip. For months, she had searched for answers, consulting every healer, mage, and scholar within reach, yet all had given her the same grim prognosis. Her father was dying, and no one knew why. But she couldn't yet accept that. Not yet. Lady Catherine, a soft voice interrupted her thoughts. Raina, her childhood friend and fellow mage, stood at the doorway, her expression filled with concern. It's still late. You should rest. I can rest, Catherine replied, her voice tight. Verse, I am so close to finding the answer. Raina stepped into the room, her robes rustling against the stone floor. You've been searching for months. If there was an answer in these scrolls, you would have found it by now. Catherine clenched her jaw. It has to be here. It has to be there. Something I am missing. Raina sighed and moved closer, her hand resting gently on Catherine's arm. You've done everything you can. Perhaps it's time to prepare for what's coming. Catherine pulled away, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't ready to give up. Not yet, not when there was still a chance, however slim, that she could save him. She turned back to the scrolls, her eyes scanning the faded text until one line caught her attention. The sword of Echo, buried deep within the cursed abyss, said to hold the power to heal even the most grievous wound. Her breath caught in her throat. The sword of Echo, a legendary weapon whispered about in tales and folklore, said to possess unimaginable power. It was a weapon that could grant life as easily as it could take it. But it was also cursed, its power corrupting anyone who wielded it. Many had sought the sword, and few had returned. Fewer still had returned with their minds intact. It's real, Catherine whispered, her fingers tracing the line of text.
Raina frowned.
What shriek? Catherine didn't respond. Instead, she crossed the room to her father's old desk and began searching through the drawers. Papers, maps, and letters spilled out, but none held what she was looking for. Desperation clawed at her until her hand brushed against something familiar. A letter, old and yellowed with age, sealed with her father's self's insignia. She broke the seal with trembling fingers and unfolded the parchment. Her father's handwriting, once bold and confident, filled the page. To my dearest daughter, Catherine, if you are reading this, then you have discovered the truth. The sword of Echo is real, and I sought it many years ago in a desperate attempt to save our family from ruin. But the sword is cursed. It demands more than one can ever give. I came close to claiming it, but I was warned. I was warned by something in the abyss, a guardian that the sword's power comes at too great a cost. I left it behind, but not without consequence, the sickness that now ravages me. I fear it is the sword's doing. I ask you, Catherine, do not follow in my footsteps. Let the sword remain lost. It is better this way. Catherine's heart pounded as she lowered the letter. Her father had known all along. He had known that the sword was real and that it was the cause of his illness. Yet he had kept it from her, hoping to protect her from the same fate. But Catherine wasn't afraid of the curse, not if it meant saving him. I have to go. Raina's eyes widened. To the abyss, said. Catherine said, her voice firm. I have to find the sword of Echo, it said, the only way to save him. Raina shook her head. No, Catherine, you can tear out the abyss is cursed. No one returns from it. I don't care, Catherine replied, her voice hardening. Ross, I am not letting my father die when there's something I can do. But the sword... I don't have a choice, Catherine interrupted. Sarah, if there's even a chance that can save him, I have to try. Raina looked at her, eyes full of sorrow. And what if the sword takes you instead? What if it's you who pays the price? Catherine didn't answer. She couldn't tell. The truth was, she didn't know what the sword would demand of her, but she couldn't tell that stop her, not when her father's life hung in the balance. Without another word, Catherine turned and left the study, her mind set on the path ahead. The abyss awaited her, and she would face whatever horrors it held if it meant saving her father. The journey to the abyss was long and treacherous. Catherine traveled alone, relying on her magic to protect her from the dangers that lurked in the wild. Dark creatures prowled the edges of the forest, their glowing eyes watching her from the shadows, but none dared attack. It was as if they could sense the power that flowed through her, the magic that crackled at her fingertip. After days of travel, Catherine finally reached the entrance to the abyss. It was a gaping maw in the earth, a pit of darkness that seemed to swallow the very light around it. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the ground beneath her feet was slick with moss and rot. She took a deep breath and stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. The moment she crossed the threshold, she felt a chill that seeped into her bones, a weight that pressed down on her shoulders. The abyss was alive, and it was watching her. Catherine summoned a ball of light in her hand, the soft glow illuminating the path ahead. The walls of the abyss were slick with moisture, and strange twisted roots hung from the ceiling like skeletal fingers. The further she descended, the heavier the air became, until it was thick and oppressive, like the weight of 1,000 eyes pressing in on her. She had heard tales of the abyss, of the creatures that lurked within its depths, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of it. The air was filled with whispers, faint and distant, like the voices of the dead. Shadows moved at the edges of her vision, shifting and writhing like living things. But Catherine pressed on, her grip tightening on the hilt of the dagger at her side. She could feel the abyss trying to get inside her head, to worm its way into her thoughts, but she wouldn't let it. She'd come too far to turn back now. After what felt like hours, she reached the heart of the abyss, a vast open chamber filled with an eerie pulsating light. In the center of the chamber stood the sword of Echo, its blade buried in the ground, its hilt glowing with an otherworldly light. Catherine approached the sword slowly, her heart racing. She could feel the power emanating from it, a dark, twisted energy that seemed to pulse in time with her own heartbeat. The sword was beautiful. In a way, its blade was sleek and black like obsidian, and the hilt was engraved with strange ancient symbols. But there was something wrong about it, something alive. As Catherine reached out to touch the hilt, a voice echoed through the chamber. "You have come for the sword." She froze, her hand hovering inches from the blade. The voice was deep and guttural, like the sound of stone grinding against stone. "Many have come before you seeking the power of the sword. Few have left, fewer still have left whole." Catherine swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her chest. "I need the sword," she said, her voice trembling. "It's the only way to save my father." There was a long silence, and then the voice spoke again. "The sword can give life, but it also takes. You cannot wield its power without paying the price." Catherine hesitated, her fingers trembling as they hovered over the hilt. She knew the sword was cursed, but she had no other choice. If she didn't try to take it, her father would die, and if the sword demanded a price, she would pay it. "I'll do whatever it takes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The voice rumbled through the chamber, cold and mocking. "Then take it, if you dare." Catherine's hand closed around the hilt of the sword of Echo. The cold, smooth metal thrummed beneath her fingers, pulsing like a living thing. For a moment, everything was still. The abyss, the air, even her own breath seemed to halt in anticipation. Then a sudden rush of power surged through her, almost knocking her off her feet. It was overwhelming, like 1,000 voices screaming in her head all at once, each one demanding her attention. Her knees buckled, but she held fast to the sword, refusing to let go. The world spun around her, the shadows of the abyss swirling and twisting in strange, unnatural patterns. She could feel the sword's sand, power seeping into her veins, dark and ancient, like the abyss itself. "You are now bound to the sword." The voice was louder now, more insistent, echoing inside her skull. "Its power is yours. But remember, every gift comes with a price." Catherine gritted her teeth, fighting to stay upright. She could feel the sword trying to worm its way deeper into her mind, to take hold of her thoughts, her will. But she wouldn't let it. She had come here for one reason, to save her father, and nothing would stop her now. She pulled the sword from the ground, its blade slicing through the air with a sharp, metallic hiss. As soon as the sword was free, the chamber around her seemed to come alive. The shadows that had been lurking at the edges of her vision surged forward, coalescing into a towering figure, a monstrous, twisted thing made of darkness and bone. Its eyes burned with an unnatural light, and its mouth was filled with rows of jagged, gleaming teeth. "You have taken the sword," the creature growled, its voice shaking the walls of the chamber. "You must face the consequences." Catherine raised the sword of Echo, her heart pounding in her chest. The creature lunged at her, its massive claws tearing through the air with terrifying speed. She barely had time to react, throwing herself to the side as the claws ripped through the space where she had been standing just moments before. The sword felt alive in her hands, guiding her movements as she dodged and parried the creature's side attack. Each time the blade struck the creature, it let out a terrible, inhuman shriek, as though the sword was not merely cutting it, but draining its very essence. But the creature was relentless, its attacks coming faster and more ferocious with every passing second. Catherine Samp's arms ached from the strain of wielding the sword, and her mind was clouded with the whispers of the abyss, each one telling her to give in, to let the sword take control. "Let me in," the sword seals hissed in her mind. "I will give you the strength you need." Catherine gritted her teeth, refusing to surrender. She didn't need the sword to think for her. She didn't need its help with a final desperate swing. She buried the blade deep into the creature's chest. The monster let out a blood-curdling roar before collapsing into a heap of shadow and dust. For a moment, everything was still. The chamber was silent, save for the sound of Catherine's labored breathing. She stood over the remains of the creature, the sword still clutched tightly in her hand. The air around her seemed to hum with the sword's power, dark and dangerous. She knew she had won the battle, but the fight was far from over. The sword had given her what she needed to defeat the guardian of the abyss, but she could feel its pull growing stronger with every passing moment. It whispered to her, coaxing her, promising her more power if only she would surrender to it fully. But Catherine couldn't afford to listen. She had to get out of the abyss. She had to save her father. With the sword in hand, she made her way back through the twisting corridors of the abyss. The path seemed longer now, more treacherous. The shadows clung to her, their voices louder, their whispers more insistent. But she pressed on, determined to escape before the abyss claimed her for good. By the time she emerged into the pale light of the surface, her body was trembling with exhaustion. The sun had begun to rise, casting a faint glow over the landscape. Catherine fell to her knees, the weight of the sword dragging her down. She could feel it now, deep inside her, dark, gnawing presence that threatened to consume her if she wasn't too careful. But she had made it. She had the sword, and now she could save her father. The journey back to her father's estate was a blur. She moved on autopilot, her thoughts consumed by the sword and the terrible choice it had placed before her. She could feel the curse of the sword growing stronger, its hunger for life becoming more insistent with each passing hour. It wanted to drain, just as it had drained the life from the guardian of the abyss. By the time Catherine reached her father's chambers, she could barely stand. Lord Roderick lay in his bed, his once strong frame reduced to little more than skin and bones. His breathing was shallow, labored, each breath a struggle. She knelt beside him, clutching the sword of Echo in her hand. The blade shimmered in the dim light of the room, its dark power pulsing in time with her own heartbeat. "Father," she whispered, her voice breaking, "I've done it. I've found the sword. I can save you." Lord Roderick S. fluttered open, dull, and glazed with pain. His gaze flickered to the sword in her hands, and for a moment, something like recognition passed over his face. "No," he rasped, his voice barely audible. "Shocked by Catherine, you mustn't." Catherine's sire clenched. She had expected him to be grateful, to rejoice in the knowledge that his life could be saved. But instead, there was only fear in his eyes, fear and sorrow. I had to," she said, her voice trembling. "It's the only way." Lord Roderick shook his head weakly. "The sword, ... Cursed. It will take more than a gift." "I don't care," Catherine cried, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I can't just let you die." Her father's hand reached out, weak and trembling, to grasp her. His grip was so light, she could barely feel it, but the weight of his words hit her like a blow. "You must destroy it," he whispered, "her before it destroys you." Catherine shook her head, refusing to accept his words. How could she destroy the only thing that could save him? How could she let him slip away when she had the power to stop it? She whispered, her voice breaking for her. "I can lose you." But even as she said the words, she could feel the sword's pull growing stronger. It whispered to her, promising her the power to save him, to make everything right. All she had to do was surrender to it. All she had to do was let go of her fear, her doubt. "You don't have to lose him," the sword whispered. "I already take my power, use it, save him." Catherine closed her eyes, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the weight of the sword in her hands, its dark magic coursing through her veins. It would be so easy to give in, to let the sword, such power wash over her, to use it to bring her father back from the brink of death. But at what cost? Catherine, her father's Sioux voice, faint and weak, broke through the fog of her thoughts. Dear, please, ... destroy it. Tears streamed down Catherine's face as she looked down at the sword. The blade shimmered in the dim light, beautiful and terrible all at once. It had the power to save him, to give him life, but it also had the power to take, to destroy, to corrupt. She had a choice to make: save her father or destroy the sword. Her hands trembled as she raised the sword, her mind warring with her heart. The weight of the decision crushed her, and she felt the sword's dark energy urging her to act, to make the impossible choice. With a scream of anguish, Catherine lifted the sword high and brought it down on the stone floor with all her strength. The blade shattered, sending shards of black metal scattering across the room. The pulse of dark energy exploded outward, and for a moment, Catherine thought the world might collapse around her. Then just as quickly, the power vanished, leaving her kneeling in silence. Lord Roderick let out a soft sigh, his hand slipping from hers. Catherine looked up to see his eyes closed, his chest no longer rising and falling with labored breaths. He was gone. A sob tore through Catherine's throat as she crumpled to the floor beside him, her heart breaking in her chest. She had made the choice. She had done the right thing, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like the end of everything. The sword of Echo was destroyed, but so was her father. She had saved him from the curse, but she hadn't been able to save his life. Catherine lay there for what felt like hours, her body racked with grief. Eventually the tears stopped, and she pushed herself to her feet. The room felt cold and empty, the weight of her decision pressing down on her with every step. She knew she had done the right thing. She had destroyed the sword, spared the world from its curse, but it had come at a terrible price. As she left the room, she took one last look at her father, lying peaceful and still. She had loved him with all her heart, and she had done everything she could to save him, but some battles couldn't be won. Some prices were too high. Catherine stepped out into the pale light of the morning sun, her heart heavy with the weight of what she had lost. But as she walked away from the estate, she knew one thing for certain. She would never let the abyss claim her. She would carry the memory of her father with her, and she would face whatever came next with the same strength that had brought her through the darkness. The echoes of the abyss might never leave her, but she would not let them define her.